Welcome to Everything All Right, the literary talk where we celebrate authors and writing in all its stunning variety. Our guest today is best-selling author, gifted cellist, and consummate gardener, Patrick Gale. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you, Ellen. It's lovely to be here.
Well, Patrick, your new book, Mother's Boy, is out. And is that you at the Isle of Wight?
And I wish, no, that's just some random antique boy that the designer found wearing a knitted costume, which is authentic for the period of the novel.
But it's a real delight to have you here today because you are actually doing quite the bookathon. How do you feel?
I'm slightly lightheaded with exhaustion, but I'm enjoying it. I love meeting readers. I think I'm one of nature's performers. So it's very strange when a book comes out, I stop being the quiet, private, stay-at-home novelist and I become this very gregarious, outgoing person who performs in marquees up and down the country.
An author today has to have many talents, that's true. So can you tell us a little bit more? Who's the mother and who's the boy?
Okay, the boy is now a famous Cornish poet, Charles Causley, but the novel is very much about the period before he becomes a novelist. So it follows him through his babyhood, boyhood, and early 20s, and through the Second World War. His mother is Laura, who is a laundress. So basically, she's a laborer. She is not somebody who would ever have expected to produce a poet of genius. And in part, the novel is about the huge debt we owe to Laura for the way in which she raised Charles single-handedly and managed to somehow set him on the path to becoming a writer.
So it's a very modern novel too, because even though it's historical fiction, of course, giving women a voice is very, very du jour. So first things first, how did you actually get into writing?
Gosh, I think I got into writing the healthiest, most natural way, which was through reading. I was one of those children who just read incessantly. And I also wrote incessantly. I realized now I was always writing stories and little exercise books. And thank God nobody encouraged me. I was just left to my own sweet devices, which I think is the best way. I think if you overly encourage a child, it makes them self-conscious or precious. And I was neither of those things. And I was lucky. I came from a very bookish household. Everyone in the house read a lot. So there were always books on every surface and people were always reading at meal times as well. And I never thought I would be a writer for a living. I always thought I was going to be either a musician or an actor. And writing was something I just enjoyed doing on the side. And it's really quite by accident, it became my main source of income.
How did you then get serious?
I think when I started making money, which took a while, it has to be said. I think I'd written 5 or 6 novels before I began to realize, oh, actually, I could concentrate on this. You know, this could actually pay the bills. It takes a while. And I think if I was starting now, I would be a dismal failure because my early novels were very undeveloped, underwritten, and uncommercial. And I don't think they'd even find a publisher these days. Things have got a lot fiercer and a lot more competitive than they were when I started out. So I would probably now be earning 3 times as much working as a psychotherapist or indeed a gardener.
So was it easy for you to get an agent, which is obviously the biggest stepping stone for an acid
Yes,
novelist?
I was very, very lucky. A friend of mine who was also at that stage trying to become an actor was working as the typist to an agent. And this is back in the pre-computer days. That's how old I am. And she slipped the manuscript to my first novel onto the pile of manuscripts she knew he was taking home for the weekend. And he rang me the following week and he said he only got in touch because the title of the book was so insane. He wanted to meet the author. And the title of the book was The Aerodynamics of Pork. And bless him, he is still, to this day, he is still my agent. It's my longest professional relationship. Editors have come and gone, but Karadek is still my agent. So I'm very
So
lucky.
So I suppose the aerodynamics of pork was not an historical fiction novel. What tempted you about pork?
No, no, it was a mad queer fantasy about a young violin prodigy who was gay and a not so young policewoman who was a lesbian. And it was written really as a kind of jeu d'esprit. I never thought it would find a publisher. And I'm amazed now when I regularly meet readers who say, "Oh, that's my favorite of your books," and I reread it all the time. I'm embarrassed that it's still in print, but it clearly meant something to somebody.
So what tempted you about Causley then and back into historical fiction?
Well, Causley really had been at the edge of my consciousness for a very, very long time. I fell in love with one of his poems when I was still a child, Timothy Winters, which is probably his most celebrated poem. And it's a poem lots of children read at school. But I didn't remember who wrote it. I just remembered the poem. And years later, when I moved to Cornwall, people kept saying to me, "Oh, you should meet Charles Causley, because he lives just up the road." And I passed up the opportunity to meet him. He was a very old man by then, but he was still alive. And then once I became established as a novelist down here, I was then approached to join the Charles Causley Trust, which was a charity set up after his death to keep his name alive. And it was really only at that point I realized what an amazing subject he was for a book. Both he and his mother. He completely fascinates me because he is such an unsexy figure. He is not a typical poet. He's not romantic. He's not an alcoholic. He doesn't have mad or suicidal wives. He leads a very quiet life. He lives with his mother. He teaches primary school and he writes poems. And officially, he dies a virgin. Now, in my research for the book, I discovered that almost certainly wasn't true. But what really interests me about him is this huge change in his attitude that happens as a result of his very traumatic experiences during the Second World War. Because before the war, I know from his private diaries, he wants to be a playwright and he wants to get as far away from his mother and Cornwall as he possibly can. If you could wave a wand over Charles Causley in the 1930s, he'd want to be living in New York or Berlin and being a full-on bohemian. Instead of which, after the war, he has become a poet and he chooses to come back to his childhood home, teach in a little tiny primary school that he went to as a boy, and live with his mother until she dies. So what my novel is trying to do is to answer the big question, which is why that change, and what made him become a poet, having been something much more center stage, if you like, as a playwright.
What finding during your research touched you most? Because it can't have been easy, the life and the existence he led in his times.
No, it was hard. I read his private diaries, his secret diaries, which are not worthy of publication. They're too dry for that. But there is something really dynamic about reading the intensely private papers of somebody. I really felt I was inside his head and I was a party to all his little tensions and fears and worries as he was growing up. And then I read the letters that he had kept, the letters that survived at least until his death. And one of those letters amazed me because it was very clearly a Dear John letter written to him by an officer in the Navy with whom he clearly had some kind of a love affair. And the letter is basically saying to him, "Charles, I'm now a married man, and please don't write to me again unless you write things you wouldn't mind my wife reading." And that really astonished me because that was proof that Charles wasn't the quiet little mouse that he had let everyone think he was, but that instead he had chosen at the end of the war to button everything up and to really hide his true nature very, very deep. And I think that's intimately linked to his becoming a poet, because poetry is a kind of code on a personal level. You can hide things in poetry. And he trained as a coder in the Navy during the war. And I think that combination of the coding training and also the fact that he discovers what he wants, what he naturally is, which we would call a gay man, is completely illegal. I mean, he could be sent to prison. So those two forces work on him to produce instead this man who is a bit like an expert spy, in that he passes for normal. He befriends people, he gets the respect of his community, and he gives nothing insignificant away. He really appears to have no emotional life at all. It's quite chilling in a way. If you told the story backwards, it would begin with a very off-putting figure, and you would slowly unpeel the layers and discover there was a beating heart beneath it. And that's where Laura comes in, because I realized, the more I researched, I realized how prickly and difficult Charles would be as a character, and that I needed a counterbalance in the shape of his mother, who would love him unconditionally, and through whose eyes we might come to love him too.
Do you regret not meeting him when you had the chance, or do you think he would have been completely buttoned up? Do you think about that?
I think he'd have been very buttoned up, especially with me, because I think he'd have thought I was a bit of a public school twit. Because Charles was very much a working class writer, and took no prisoners really in terms of the class war. And I think he'd have been unnerved by how openly gay I am. I think that wouldn't have made him comfortable at all. So although I regret not meeting him, I'm quite glad I didn't meet him, because I think had I met him, I would never have written this novel. I'd have been too inhibited by my knowledge of him.
And speaking of Causley as the UK's perhaps only working class poet, looking at writing today in a wider sense, do you think it's still a problem of British literature that there are too little working class voices?
No, I think that has changed hugely. It is becoming a lot more democratic. I think thanks to the freedom to self-publish digitally, that is really changing the things. But what is changing at a snail's pace is the structure within publishing houses. So the gatekeepers, by and large, are still privately educated, perhaps not as upper middle class now as they were when I first went into publishing. That used to be the case. But the will to change is there. And I think the same is true when it comes to race. I think publishers are now recruiting more and more editors of colour, in the hope that that will in turn attract writers of colour into the fold. It's a slow process, and I really understand the intense frustration of working class readers who don't see themselves reflected in what they read a lot of the time.
Let's go from talking about Mother's Boy to the general practicalities. Describe us your writing day. Do you have any must-haves?
I need to have peace and quiet, which is why this little shed I'm speaking to you from is perfect, because it's very, very soundproof. And I write with a fountain pen on paper. So my needs are actually very simple. I can write anywhere. I quite often write out of doors in the garden. And I try to make the most of the morning, because I've learned over time that my brain definitely goes downhill after lunch. I have a dip from about 1 till about 4 o'clock, during which I won't try to write. I will read, or I'll answer emails and letters. But the morning is a good time for me. And I very rarely am alone here. If my husband goes away, I will write at night, because my brain really picks up again in the evening. And occasionally I treat myself to a writing retreat. I'll rent somewhere remote and go away to write. And I will routinely write for half the night when I do that.
So what is your top tip for any nascent novelist?
Well, have a go at writing with ink. Seriously, it is revolutionary. It's very simple, and it lets you, crucially, it lets you write slowly. I'm a very, very fast typist, I think, because I trained as a pianist in childhood. And I find if I try to type creatively, I produce words too rapidly, it becomes too facile. And I sort of produce a kind of journalese rather than what I think of as finished prose. So if I write in ink, it's coming out more at the speed of my thoughts. But the really important thing about writing in ink is seeing your crossings out. Do you remember when you were little and you were learning how to do long division and the teacher would say, show your workings? Well, it's important for writers, I think, to see their workings. And the downside of word processing software is that it encourages us to have this artificial tidiness on the page. You delete all too easily, and what you've deleted just disappears. If somebody was to produce a form of word processing software that put every deleted item to the left of the margin or something, so you can still see it, that would help. But for now, I think writing in ink is a revelation. And every time I've got writing students to do it, under duress, I mean, they will really complain. They always say, actually, they did really good work. So that's, I think, the best tip I can give. Get a nice pen, get a lovely bit of stationery, and have a go.
Celebrate your writing. Absolutely.
Yeah, celebrate your writing. And also there's something rather magical about working in this old-fashioned way where you don't have to be plugged into anything. So you don't need power. You need ink, but you don't need power. You won't be distracted by the internet while you're writing. And you just go off into this wonderful parallel universe, which is your emerging book.
So once you've crossed the finishing line in your Mother's Boy bookathon, what is next for you?
Gosh, I have lots of different creative projects lining up at the moment, and they all want my attention. I have another historical novel I'm already planning, which is a sequel to my earlier novel, A Place Called Winter. That was trying to solve a mystery in the life of my great-grandfather, Harry Kane, who ran away from his wife and child to be a farmer in Canada. And in real life, in 1953, Harry came back to England. He sold the farm in Canada and expected my grandmother, who was now, 56, and who he hadn't seen since she was a toddler, he expected her to take him in. So what I want to write is a rather dark comedy about that year, and in which my mother and my grandmother and their husbands will be the main characters. It's quite a strange process trying to turn my relations into characters, but happily they're all dead, so they can't fight back. But alongside that, I've got 2 theatre pieces I'm working on. I've been commissioned to write a play adapting my last novel, Take Nothing With You, and that's steaming ahead. That's a very musical play. There's got to be lots of live music on stage, so we're having workshops with musicians and actors playing around really to see how best to convey the music in the book. And I'm also working on a musical which is based on my television show Man in an Orange Shirt, so that there's a lot to get on with.
Yes, it all sounds fabulous, and that takes us right away actually to the end of our show, and that's the 5 faves. So Patrick, very quickly, your favorite movie?
My favorite movie off the top of my head, Now Voyager with Bette Davis.
Favorite book?
Favorite book, George Eliot's Middlemarch.
Favorite music score?
Favorite music score? Ooh, that'll be an opera, Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes.
Favorite food?
Favorite food, any kind of pasta.
And a favorite travel destination?
Favorite travel destination, that's hard. Do you know, I think probably Paris.
That's lovely, and we'll let you go with that because Patrick is actually busy with something else this afternoon. Will you say it, Patrick?
Yes, I'm learning to be a beekeeper, and I am bracing myself to go to my very first practical session in the local apiary. So I'm probably going to be stung to bits.
Well, hopefully next time, Patrick.
But I bought myself a very fancy beekeeping suit, complete with
I was hoping
built-in hat.
to see it. I was hoping to see it, but hopefully next time Patrick can tell us something about the aerodynamics of beekeeping. That would be fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you, Ellen. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching Everything All Right. My guest today was Patrick Gale. We talked about his novel Mother's Boy, which is out with Tinder Press. Order the novel online, or better still at your local bookstore. Buy it directly. Other than that, I'm Ellen Alpsten. Stick around, subscribe to Everything All Right, be in the know, listen and watch us next week. Thank you so much.